Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Holocaust Remembrance, presented by the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council and the town of Concord. My name is Shari Barzan. I am one of the co-chairs of the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council. In lieu of a printed program, here is the order of presenters for tonight's event. Terry Ackerman of the Board of Selectmen will speak first, followed by Rabbi Darby of Congregation Karem Shalom. I will then introduce tonight's main speaker, Johanna Glaser. After her presentation, we will have a brief Q&A with Johanna. Next, we will show a recording of an original song by Karem Shalom's cantor, Rosalie Garut. And Louisa Poster, my co-chair, will have concluding remarks. Here now is Terry Ackerman.
Thank you, Shari. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending today. I'm Terry Ackerman, a member of the Select Board in the town of Concord, and I want to thank Ronnie Olitsky and the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council for organizing today's Holocaust Memorial. Every year, as you know, for the past 10 years, the Human Rights Council and the Select Board in Concord have collaborated to co-sponsor this important event. So this year, on March 8th, the Select Board voted to proclaim the week of April 4th through April 11th, 2021, as Days of Remembrance for the Victims of the Holocaust. As we know, the Holocaust occurred in Nazi Germany during World War II in the 1940s. But unfortunately, fear, ignorance, and hatred are not limited to that time period or that nation. In the US, white supremacist, anti-Semitic, and anti-LGBTQ propaganda have almost doubled in the 1 year between 2019 and 2020. In fact, 2020 had the highest level ever recorded by the Anti-Defamation League. So the times we're living in are certainly scary and remind us of just how easy it is for fascism to rise to power. And we really have to remain ever vigilant and never let a Holocaust happen again. Coming up on June 13th is Race Amity Day, which we will celebrate, especially the greatest asset of the towns of Concord and Carlisle, which is our people. We are multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multiracial citizens, and we share common ideals of friendship, civility, respect, and kindness. So let us join in introspection as we reflect on the beauty and richness of our diverse community, while reaching out with the spirit of friendship toward one another. We will now hear a brief pre-recorded message from Rabbi Darby of Congregation Karem Shalom.
Shalom, Bruchim Habayim, welcome and good evening. Thank you so much to the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council for hosting this Holocaust Memorial event and for doing so every year. Thank you also to Ronnie and to the entire council for the kind invitation to share a few thoughts with you this evening. And thank you also to Jeremy for helping to record these remarks in advance. It is meaningful to me to be recording these remarks on April 8th, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, even though I know they will be shared with you on Sunday, April 11th. 21 years ago today, I participated in a march from the concentration camp of Auschwitz to the camp of Birkenau, and thought deeply about my maternal grandparents of blessed memory who survived the Shoah, that horrible moment in human history. The Holocaust and the memories and the stories of it have deeply informed my life, as I am sure they have informed many of yours as well. Judaism teaches us deeply of the power of memory and of the power of memory to continue to influence and inform who we are in the world in our lives. There is a saying in the Jewish community around the Shoah, never forget. which of course is the flip side of always remember. But why? Why do we wish to remember this horrific event? Why do we gather like this every year to study and learn something in relationship to the Shoah? I deeply believe that it is not for the sake of walking around with painful and dark memories, but rather so that these memories can continue to influence and inform who we are today and how we are in this world as we live our lives. As many of you know, we are in this interesting moment in the Jewish calendar between the holidays of Pesach or Passover and Shavuot, when we count the Omer, or essentially count the days between Passover and Shavuot. We count 7 days a week or 7 weeks or 49 days. And there is a custom during this period of studying the sacred Jewish text of the Mishnah. And in my studies, I was struck again by the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, teaching 17, which essentially states that action in this world, hama'asot, is more important or greater than midrash or study. But is it? Judaism also teaches us about the importance of study, of intellectual engagement, of Talmud Torah, of the learning and the study of Torah. Well, there is also a fairly well-known teaching from the Talmud in Kiddushin 40b, in which two rabbis, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, were debating this very question: which is more important, study or action? Rabbi Tarfon states that action in the world is greater or more important, and Rabbi Akiva states the opposite, that study is more important or greater. And the text continues by teaching us that Kulam Omum, everyone in the house of study said, Talmud Gadol, Talmud Mevi Lidei Maaseh, or study is greater because it leads to action, or the study that leads to action is greater. In light of that powerful teaching, it is my kavanah, my hope, and my intention that our gathering here this evening and listening to our teacher, Johanna Glaser, remark will not be an intellectual activity for its own sake, but rather that this gathering this evening and our learning together may spur all of us to take meaningful action in this world to ensure that we as a human species continue to grow in our ability to live together, to share this planet and its resources with each other, and to continue to work toward the future in which all people have the same rights and opportunities to live, to laugh, to love, and to be. Thank you. May our study today to lead us all to meaningful action in this world. And Shavua Tov. May it be a good week for everyone, and may we all stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Darby. Good evening, everyone, again, and welcome to our Holocaust Remembrance. The Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council is an organization of volunteers working to foster respect, understanding, goodwill, and conciliation among individuals and groups in our community. We are dedicated to the belief that all people are entitled to dignity and respect. We have been co-hosting this observance with the town for many years, usually in person at the townhouse. So we are very grateful to be able to hold it this year live on Zoom with the invaluable help of Senior Administrative Assistant Jeremy Romanol and Administrative Manager and Zoom Master Chris Carmody. Holocaust awareness and remembrance are critical for any society if we don't want to repeat the horrors of Nazi Germany. In April 7th's Boston Globe, columnist Jeff Jacoby wrote an article titled "The Problem with Holocaust Education." He wrote about a study comprised of interviews with 11,000 Millennial and Generation Z respondents. They were asked 30 questions designed to measure their threshold awareness of the Holocaust. What the study revealed was a worrying lack of basic Holocaust knowledge. 63% of millennials and Gen Zers do not even know that 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany. When asked if they could name any of the more than 40,000 concentration camps, ghettos, or extermination sites into which Jews were forced, 48% were unable to identify even one. More than 20% could not be sure that they had definitely heard about the Holocaust. He went on to say, "Never has the Holocaust been so earnestly and widely taught, yet never has it been so clear that its lessons are unlearned. The cancer of anti-Semitism is spreading, and there is no deadlier symptom of failure." With that, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Johanna Glaser has been a social studies teacher at Concord Carlisle High School for 25 years. She is currently teaching a course titled Dictatorship and Democracy. Johanna strives to help students understand the difficult history of the Holocaust while also connecting to the world in which we currently reside. Johanna will leave some time at the end of her presentation for questions. If you would like to submit a question, please write it by clicking on the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many as we can. Thank you all very much for your attention. I now turn it over to Johanna.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to the Human Rights Council and the Select Board for putting this together. It's a great privilege to be here to speak with all of you, and great thanks to Rabbi Darby for his meaningful message. I do have some slides to share, mostly to give you something to look at other than me. And you will see interspersed with the quotes and statistics, some images of some of the many powerful Holocaust memorials around the world. Let me just share this. Okay. So I'm going to jump right in with some statistics, and you've heard some of them already, but I think they are a powerful way to provide a good foundation for considering the importance of Holocaust education. Unfortunately, hate crimes in the US are at their highest level in more than a decade. And we've seen stark reminders of these crimes in the news. Anti-Asian hate crimes were up 150% in 2020, and we know 2021 is no better. The ADL reported in December of 2018 that 80% of European Jews feel that anti-Semitism in their country has increased over the past 5 years, and 40% live in daily fear of being physically attacked. This year, 2021, 59% of Jewish Americans reported feeling less safe than a decade ago. Add to that what Sherry was referring to, 41% of Americans ages 18 to 39 say that fewer than 2 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And of this group, 66% couldn't say what Auschwitz was. This map breaks it down by state, but it averages out to that 41%. 56% reported having seen Nazi symbols on social media or in their communities within the past 5 years, and more than half had seen examples of Holocaust denial. Only 43% of Americans know that Hitler came to power through a democratic process. Instead, a majority believe that he came to power through force. And beyond the statistics, Nazi imagery and other symbols of hate brought by insurgents into our Capitol building on January 6th are haunting. And locally, recent news from the Duxbury football team or the dozens of kids who taunted Newton basketball players a few years ago with chants of "You killed Jesus" remind us that there is much work to be done. We know that there are fewer and fewer survivors of the Holocaust among us. And we are fortunate that groups and individuals have had the foresight and the dedication to collect stories and testimonies, whether through Yad Vashem, which has a very extensive library of survivor testimonies, or the Shoah Foundation, which recently began doing holographic testimonies, or the work of filmmakers and historians around the world, like Concord's own Susan Reeder, who powerfully told the story of Carola Domar, a survivor who lived here in Concord. These stories must be collected, shared, and honored. We must keep listening, keep being reminded of the horrors and the struggles, as well as the survival and the recovery. For today's young people, the Holocaust was their great-grandparents' or even great-great-grandparents' generation. For them, the story feels long ago. And for many, particularly for those not of European descent, Europe feels like a world away. How do we make these stories seem relevant? How do we help students today understand how important it is to remember and learn from the Holocaust? The world right now is filled with pain and uncertainty. And we know from the data and from our own observations that young people are struggling. They look around and they see racial injustice, economic inequality, the increasingly inevitable devastation of climate change, and of course, pandemic. Just to name a few of the challenges sitting on their shoulders. Why would anyone want to study the horrors of the past when the present seems so daunting? The Holocaust is so big, so horrific. Why do we want to put ourselves through studying it? Why would we as adults put our children through it? Ultimately, we know we must. We know that the consequences of forgetting are enormous. It's incumbent on us all to remember, to honor, to learn, and to teach. To quote a CCHS junior, Livy Jelen, she wrote, "The frustration we all feel in this day and age can make our voice feel powerless. It makes us passive and pessimistic. But when we recoil from the world around us, sheltering ourselves from the injustices that seem commonplace, that is when cries for help go unnoticed." And so with that in mind, I'd like to share with you an overview of what Holocaust education can look like, some of the lessons that I've found powerful for students, and some of the ways that Holocaust education can help us better face the world in which we live. And I'm all too conscious of the weight of responsibility tonight. There are so many to honor, remember, and pay tribute to. And there are so many aspects of the story that deserve to be told. I cannot touch them all. Who am I to address these topics that are so big and so important and so worthy of honor and memorial? I'm not a witness, but my duty as an educator and a person is to bear witness, to preserve the memories, to face the past, and to ask others to face it with me. I find particular power and meaning in Maya Angelou's words from On the Pulse of Mourning. She said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." And this evening, I will do my best to honor and face our past with courage. Let me give you a little background on how I ended up here. While I knew I wanted to teach from an early age, the what and the why of wanting to teach came into focus for me when I was a senior in high school, taking a social studies elective course on the Holocaust. The course challenged me as a thinker and helped drive me towards the study of history. In college at Brandeis University, I got involved in the school's Holocaust Remembrance Week, and as a junior took on the leadership role for that week-long event. I spent the months leading up to the week working closely with survivors and children of survivors to create meaningful programming for the Brandeis community and beyond. I was proud of the numerous campus and community-wide events we organized for that week of remembrance. But what bothered me, and still does, is that it became a big deal that I was organizing the event. The reason that I became a piece of the story is because I'm the daughter of a Lutheran minister and the granddaughter of a Christian theologian who was dean of Harvard Divinity School and the Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm. A newspaper from South Dakota even sent a reporter all the way to Waltham to do a story on the non-Jewish woman leading this event. In part as a result of the publicity over the next few years, I led several workshops for youth groups around the country focused on developing knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust. And while I was grateful for those opportunities, my feeling was the publicity was misguided. It shouldn't be a big deal for me to care about these issues. It shouldn't be a big deal for me to care about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not just a Jewish story, and we are all responsible for the work of memory and memorial. more so now as the years pass. My education in the late 80s and early 90s was punctuated with statements of never again, and those who do not learn their history are doomed to repeat it. And yet, as I entered adulthood, hearing about ethnic and racial hatred and genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda, those promises began to feel hollow. As we look at the 21st century and witness atrocities around the world, the plight of the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, the rising cases of racism, anti-Semitism, ignorance, and hate, it is only natural to wonder if maybe we have forgotten. I, like many of my students, and I suspect many of you, cannot help but wonder, what should my role be? How do I honor my commitment to never again? How do I live up to my values when the world feels so daunting? And so ultimately, with all that in mind, what does Holocaust education mean in 2021? Today, only about a third of US states require Holocaust education as a part of their school curriculum. Massachusetts is not one of them. It is worth noting that required Holocaust education does not necessarily correlate with student knowledge of the Holocaust. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Massachusetts ranked highest in Holocaust knowledge, and yet none of those states require Holocaust education. Perhaps greater requirements would help, and there is currently a move in that direction around the country and locally on Beacon Hill. But as you might imagine, social studies frameworks are highly political and often problematic, so they may not be the solution to the problem. There are many incredible resources for Holocaust education that are widely available online. Pieces of the curriculum used in our schools here in Concord, as well as at Karem Shalom's Hebrew School, were developed by Brookline-based Facing History and ourselves. Facing History is an excellent organization that has provided powerful curriculum and superb professional development to teachers around the world for the past 40 years. While their original and most developed focus is the Holocaust, they have expanded into numerous other curriculum areas, including Reconstruction, slavery, and racism in the US, the Armenian genocide, democracy and civic engagement, immigration, and much, much more. Here in Concord, students learn about the Holocaust in the 8th grade in some depth as part of a full year curricular focus on justice. As part of the 3-month unit, they learn about the Holocaust using lessons from Facing History. They read fiction and nonfiction and examine the resilience of the characters. They read and discuss Simon Wiesenthal's The Sunflower and participate in lessons on perspective taking, empathy, and compassion, as well as respect for diversity. They read and write poetry and ultimately conduct research and contribute to an 8th grade walking museum entitled A Tribute to the Resilience of the Human Spirit. In fact, earlier today, one of the Concord 8th graders was honored for her first place win of the Israel Arbiter Holocaust Essay Contest, organized by the Jewish Community Relations Council. In the 10th grade, the Holocaust is addressed again as part of the US history course. Students are asked to evaluate the response of the United States to the Holocaust, the role of anti-Semitism, the turning away of Jewish refugees, and the choices that the US made during the war and upon liberation of the camps. In non-COVID years, some students have had the opportunity to travel to Central Europe on a World War II Cold War history and culture tour, led by social studies teacher Agatha Wozniak. Through this immersion in local history and culture, students feel the weight of the history around them and tackle difficult questions regarding sacrifice, memory, and fear. Students recognize the need for commemoration of the Holocaust and preservation of cultural elements being lost to time. While the trip itinerary has varied from year to year, the trips have included Germany, Poland, and Hungary, and cover a variety of historical and cultural topics in these countries, with the Holocaust being one of the primary World War II topics. Past trips have visited Dachau, the Nuremberg Trials Museum and Documentation Center, the Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, among many other sites. The trip is extraordinarily powerful for students. At CCHS, our juniors and seniors are given the opportunity to sign up for elective courses in social studies, and we have an amazing slate of offerings in history and social science. The elective I currently teach is a course entitled Dictatorship and Democracy. This elective course is designed to take students thinking about genocide and the Holocaust further than they have in the past, as they're able to do now as juniors and seniors. While the scope of my course involves dictators from the 20th and 21st century and from around the world, we use Nazi Germany as a primary case study. I'll give you a quick overview of what we look at, focused on the Nazi Germany case study, and then dig into a little bit more depth with a few key themes and lessons. In a normal year, which this was not, we begin with the role of identity and culture in Europe prior to Hitler's rise. We spend time examining the long history of anti-Semitism, the development of, quote, racial science, and the rise of the eugenics movement. We also examine the role of identity in the Armenian genocide and the significance of that history, which is too often forgotten or ignored. We then look at the formation and culture of Weimar Germany and the challenges they faced. We focus on the question, why did democracy fail? And we begin to look at the rise of the Nazis. We look at the everyday choices Germans faced and emphasize the fact that real people made real choices and that the Nazis came to power within the framework of a democratic system. While we certainly look at the camps and the horrors of the Holocaust, I also want students to see resistance. We spend time looking at the forms of moral and spiritual resistance that was often the only choice, finding a way to pray or hold services in the ghettos or the camps, the blowing of a shofar at Auschwitz, the struggle to sanctify life when its destruction is the very goal of one's enemies. And of course, we look at the more active forms of resistance, the stories of rebellions and partisans and rescuers, the stories of resistance. Through these stories, we are reminded of the incredible power of the human spirit, even in times of incredible darkness. We then cover questions of justice and memory. We examine whether justice is possible and consider different approaches, from Nuremberg to the International Criminal Court and the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. We discuss the role of memory and memorial and examine our responsibility to the future. Finally, students make connections to the world around us, looking at the challenges we face today and the ways that they can have a voice in the world. In a normal year, our final unit asks them to consider their own role in standing up for their values against hate and injustice. So that's the quick overview. But to see the depth and meaning in these topics and the connections to today, we must look a bit more closely. When studying the Holocaust or any example of racial and ethnic tensions, it's valuable to begin with an understanding of identity. Who are we as individuals and as members of a group? How do we think about us and how do we think about them? When we look at the history and the present of anti-Semitism, we see the ways that this idea of us and them is used to undermine some groups and to promote others. We begin to see the tendency of humans to create scapegoats and to use the idea of us and them as we search for simple answers to our complex problems. This we and they language shows up in our conversations about race, class, immigration, and more. By studying the Holocaust, students learn to see the dangers of these divisions, and some begin to recognize the coded language and the dog whistles that are far too present in our current political rhetoric. They're able to identify the very language that keeps us divided. Understanding the role of identity and us and them helps us to understand the Holocaust, and it helps us to better understand and function in our world today. An examination of Weimar Germany and the rise of the Nazis is a particularly important unit in the Dictatorship and Democracy course. Pundits have spent much time over the last 4 years or so drawing connections between Weimar Germany and the current state of the US, and so it's not surprising that this feels relevant to students now. I often remind my students of the quote attributed to Mark Twain: History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And there have been times that it's felt like there's a lot of rhyming going on. I'm not going to give you a full history of Weimar. We take weeks to do that in class. I'll point out, though, that when one looks at Weimar Germany, we have a chance to see what happens when a democracy is weak. Germany during the Weimar years suffered multiple traumas, from the loss of World War I to the Versailles Treaty, the claim of Dolchstoß, or the stab in the back, that was the big lie spread by Weimar's critics. They claimed that the war had not been lost, but rather that Germany had been stabbed in the back by people from within, particularly socialists and Jews. This lie had tremendous staying power and helped to undermine the legitimacy of the government. In addition to that, there were massive reparations payments. Germany faced mismanagement of the economy and hyperinflation, and the devastation and confusion that comes from seeing hard work and life savings disappear overnight. Germany also saw culture wars dividing the population and armed militia threatening the government and bringing violence to the streets. The challenges were numerous and ultimately insurmountable in a country where many were unsure that democracy was a good choice for government in the first place. And these challenges opened the door for the Nazis to come to power. The Nazis drew into their fold those who felt disillusioned and cut off from the future that they had been promised, those looking for someone to blame and someone to give them hope. The Nazis worked within the democratic system laid out in the Weimar Constitution to rise to power. In January of 1933, Hitler was appointed as chancellor by President Hindenburg. 2 months later, in March of 1933, soon after the Reichstag fire, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler almost unfettered power. And finally, in August of 1934, Hindenburg died and Hitler united the presidency and the chancellorship into the single office of the Führer. The political power shifted legally and gradually. Hitler and the Nazis did not conquer an unwitting Germany by force. Gaining political power is one thing, but how the Nazis achieved control over the society is another, and perhaps even more important issue. How is it possible that millions of people allowed for the movement towards oppression and ultimately to genocide? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because of a few crazy or power-hungry individuals. It happened slowly and with the consent of millions. In class, we talk about the narrowing circle and look at laws against Jewish people from 1932 to 1939. We look at the way that liberties were systematically stripped from the Jewish community. It started slow. First, exclusion from the arts and certain professions, a one-day boycott of Jewish businesses, and then, step by step, the limits increased and the options narrowed. Limits on marriages, limits on property, and ultimately the removal of citizenship, the exclusion from all professions, and requirements to wear identifying markers. We examine the difficulty of responding to this narrowing circle and reflect on the risks and challenges of standing up against the regulations, as well as the many reasons why people couldn't just leave. We consider the choiceless choices that so many individuals and families faced. And we also look from the perspective of the average non-Jewish German. What choices did they make as they saw the circle narrowing for their Jewish neighbors? We read stories of people who chose to go along, and we examine the reasons for their choices. The professor who saw that support for the Nazis meant more money for his department. The person who chose to keep his job rather than stand up for his Jewish colleagues, reasoning that he could be more helpful if he were still employed. One story that particularly resonates with students is the story of Ruth. Ruth was a schoolgirl who was known as the kindest, sweetest, most considerate kid in school, who also happened to be a devoted Nazi. The reading about Ruth recounts her progression as she handed out pamphlets and would say to her non-Aryan classmates, "Oh, of course they don't mean you, you're a good German." And later, when she apologized to the Jewish students to whom she could no longer talk, She would say, "The party must know what they're doing, and mistakes will get straightened out later." Ruth's story resonates as she seems so normal, and yet she followed the Nazi party line. And as we examine the horrors of the Holocaust itself, we look at the research that has been done around Reserve Police Battalion 101, a battalion of ordinary men who participated in deportations and mass killings of Jews in Poland. The stories of these men highlight the impact of anti-Semitism, the pressure they felt to conform, the concern they had that they might damage their careers if they refused to participate, and the all too human ways they justified their role in the killings. These stories remind us that while monsters like Mengele certainly existed, the story of the Holocaust is a wider story than that. It is sadly a human story. Because when we focus exclusively on the evil of the Nazis and the Holocaust, we begin to regard its perpetrators and collaborators as monsters who are fundamentally unlike ourselves. We begin to see us as good and them as evil, and the story can become a morality tale that reassures us of our own goodness, instead of recognizing the human capacity for violence and injustice. If the history of the Holocaust is simply black and white, good and evil, it can play into it can't happen here kind of exceptionalism that blinds us to the injustices and the violence in our own history and our own present. Instead, these stories, the stories of real people who made real choices that led to genocide, force us to ask ourselves, what would we do? What are we doing to address injustice? When do we choose to act? And when do we decide to keep our head down and not make waves? What line would have to be crossed for us to get up and move, to quit our jobs and protest? As I say to students, we can never know for sure what we would have done, and I think it's a conceit to think we can. Instead, learning about the choices people made and considering what we would have wanted to have done will make us more likely to live by our values if we ever face similar choices ourselves. Understanding the fall of Weimar reminds us that democracy is fragile. Understanding the rise of the Nazis reminds us that humans are susceptible to manipulation, that we can have monstrous tendencies, that prejudice, hate, and dehumanization are powerful forces that can lead us down terrible paths. The Holocaust forces us to look at the darkest depths of humanity. And as someone who often finds myself studying these dark moments in our history, I also see that they can teach us about the tremendous power of the human spirit, the possibilities for resistance, resilience, and unity in the face of horrors, and the power we have to stand up against hatred, prejudice, and evil. The history of the Nazis and the Holocaust ultimately allows us to examine the power of our own voices and our own choices. What power do we as individuals have? What power do my students as teenagers have to stand up for others and make a difference? While the Holocaust reminds us of our potential for evil, it also demonstrates the ways that individuals can stand up against oppression and to fight against injustice. Facing history in ourselves emphasizes the role of upstanders, and that idea of standing up for others feels more important to me now than ever. In an uncertain world, finding a voice, realizing you can make a difference, and recognizing ways to stand up and be heard can be empowering and powerful. We use resistance during the Holocaust as a jumping off point to look at the power of individuals and groups who push back against oppression. I often look with students at the Not in Our Town movement that came out of a series of racist and anti-Semitic acts in Billings, Montana. In the early 90s, white supremacist activity grew in and around Billings, accompanied by racial slurs, death threats, and the harassment of the Jewish, Latinx, Black, LGBTQ, and Native American communities. Many were hesitant to speak out, and others didn't know how to make a difference. In December of 1993, someone threw a cinder block through a child's bedroom window, a window that displayed an image of a menorah. In response, people around town began to place images of menorah in their own windows. The newspaper even printed a full-page picture of a menorah that could be cut out, and nearly 10,000 people put one in their window. Local businesses joined in as well, and one posted a large sign that said, "Not in our town, no hate, no violence, peace on earth." And this was not the only example of the town finding power in unity. When services at a Black church were interrupted by white supremacists, other religious groups volunteered to attend and offer security. When a Native American's family's house was vandalized, 30 members of the Painters Union jumped in to repaint the home. The power of unity and allyship in Billings was recounted in a documentary and helped to create a movement that continues to inspire people all over the country today to stand together against hate and injustice. The Not in Our Town movement reminds us that we are all neighbors. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are inevitably our brother's keeper because we are our brother's brother. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In a world that seems so challenging, we must find ways to make our voices heard. From sit-ins, protests, and rallies, to boycotts, to letter writing and social media campaigns, holding public officials accountable, and direct political involvement, there are so many ways that people of any age can and do make their voices heard. And everyone, no matter what our own personal skill set, has something to offer to their cause, whether behind the scenes or on the front lines. We just have to recognize that we can't remain silent. Building young people who are resilient and see opportunities to stand up for others helps to inoculate us, a little anyway, against hate and oppression. Because sadly, the Holocaust is not the world's only genocide. However, its memory is essential to understanding the dangers the world faces, from anti-Semitism, racism, ignorance, and hatred. We must honor the 6 million Jews and millions of others, homosexuals, Roma and Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so many more who died at the hands of Nazi aggression. We must honor them by standing up and calling out injustices around us now. We must also own our own ugly history, our history of racism, slavery, and the annihilation of America's indigenous people. We must face our past with courage and recognize the ways that our own history of brutal injustice has left a legacy of bigotry and hate. And we must acknowledge that simply remembering the Holocaust is not an antidote to hatred and injustice. Knowing is not enough. We must act. Let me return to a student's words. Livy Jelen, who took the Dictatorship and Democracy course last fall and who traveled on the World War II school trip to Europe and visited Dachau 2 years ago, wrote the following. The Holocaust cannot only be remembered for the pain it inflicted upon its victims. It must be remembered for the brave acts of those who resisted in the silent corners nobody can recall. Courageous men and women who derailed enemy train routes, groups of resistance fighters fighting both outside in the forests and inside the ghettos. Everyday civilians who hid families in their cellars or under their floorboards. If we remember history as only the enormous, terrible acts of evil that the worst of us perpetuate, we are doing a huge disservice to anyone who rose above it all to whisper a prayer in their last moments or fight for their last breath. Reading and listening to these stories should inspire future generations to fully embody the words, "What you do matters." When you see an injustice, speak up, record it, tell someone, keep your eyes open to the world around you and never shroud yourself in ignorance. Yes, the Holocaust is a period of human history that can be too painful to even think about. Even so, empower yourself with knowledge and the courage to do what is right as much as you are able to. unquote. And finally, as Rabbi Tarfon wrote, based on the words from the book of Micah, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So let us honor the victims of the Shoah and commit to doing the work together for ourselves and for generations to come.
Johanna, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. That was really something. My name is Louisa Poster. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Human Rights Council, and we would be happy to take any questions if anybody would like to put any in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We have one person saying a tremendously powerful message. Thank you. Do any of the panelists have any questions? Or I have a question. How many students are in your classes every year? Like how many students get to hear your words and your lessons?
So when we look at the whole school and the whole or the whole system rather, all the kids go through the 8th grade program and through the 10th grade program. There are, I think, just over a dozen kids each year who are able to go on the World War II Cold War trip. My classes I've had, this past year I had 50, I had 2 sections. And last year I only had 1 section, but next year I believe I have 2 sections again. So.
Great. Good. Well, you really bring the humanity of people's decisions to light with them. And I think I bet that's probably what they most identify with is you're getting them to think, what would I do? I think that's so important. So I don't see any questions. Oh, I see Rosalie has a question.
Well, it's not a question exactly. It's just to say, Johanna, that brought me to tears. I'm the daughter of survivors of the Holocaust, and I believe exactly what you're doing is the right thing. It's not only what we do is we remember, we don't forget so that we don't have this repeated in the world. And my friends who are in Berlin, we work together to try to overcome the guilt and the blindness and the pain together and start acting in the way that you have told us today. I really, really appreciate your work. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Rosalie.
And Stephen Crane has a question, our town manager.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for having me here this evening. And I agree, it was really compelling remarks. I just wanted to, I don't have a question, but I just want to say I recently read a book called Freedom from Fear, which was about the years between 1925 and 1945. I'd seen something about it saying how those times almost seemed darker than the ones we're in. And I was reading it at the beginning of January. And what was really, what was really amazing and shocking in many ways was exactly what you said. It wasn't one sweeping thing that happened. It was a series of very small things. I think it's that reminder that the things we see around us happening today may not be on their face a big deal, but there was a cumulative impact. And when the next affront and the next injustice is beyond the last one, it's really troubling for me. So I just, your remarks really brought that home for me again. So thank you so much. For very powerful.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have a couple of questions wondering if you'd be willing to give a course through Concord Adult Ed, or if you are involved in any professional development for teachers.
I hadn't thought about doing a course through Adult Ed.
I did while you were talking. I thought I would like to take your course.
That's an interesting idea. Certainly something that I could think about. And I haven't done any professional development around this recently, but it's something. one of the things within the social studies department at the high school anyway, is that we all work very, very closely together. And that's a wonderful professional environment to work in, that we share ideas and share information with each other.
Great, okay. Now another question, as a teacher unafraid of tackling some of the most difficult and divisive topics possible, how do you encourage students to voice their true questions and thoughts without fearing repercussions in this environment?
It's a great question. And I think one of the challenges of our society right now is that it is so hard to talk with each other. That we have so much division, and we have so little ability to always see where other people are coming from. And I do think that as a teacher, it's really important to create a safe environment where students can share their questions and share their ideas. And it's also important that it remains a safe environment. And so I think one of the things that I try to do is to make a clear statement that all perspectives are valued, and perspectives that demean somebody, that undermine the humanity of people, are not. And that is a challenge at times. But I think it's really important that we hear each other's perspectives, and we try to understand that the world is not black and white, and that there is nuance, and there are ways that we should talk with each other and come to understand each other, because until we do that, we can't move beyond where we are right now.
Good, all right. And there's two more questions. One is, how can we help the victims of the Uyghur genocide? Do you ever talk about this with students?
We talk about what's happening with the Uyghurs, and look at some of the issues around it. The question with so much of this is, what can we do when it feels so far away? And for some, it depends on the situation. So the first step, I think, is that learning, knowing as much as you can, and opening up avenues to consider our options, to consider how much influence can I have on what's happening in China? And that's where looking at where political pressure can come in, looking at the power of boycotts, looking at international organizations and the way that they can make a difference, starting to understand some of those international connections can become really, really important. But it's a challenging one because it is so far away.
Yeah.
But I think that first piece is to learn and to start to recognize where the possible inroads are.
Wise thinking. Okay, let's see. Polly Atwood, our former chair for years and years, asks, does it get tricky relating the history to current happenings, and do you ever get accused of being too political?
I have not been.
Okay.
I try very hard to walk carefully, but at the same time, I think it is important to look at those current events. And the end of my semester with Dictatorship and Democracy this year, our last 2 weeks was in the wake of January 6th. And so certainly we had to talk about that.
Yeah.
And And so I think that, you know, my duty as an educator is to address the politics, to address what's going on. And I think as a social studies teacher, I have the responsibility to do that. And to make sure that I'm not sharing my own opinion, that I'm providing facts, that I am trying to provide a balance as much as I can, while making sure that truth and humanity are respected.
Okay, great. I think we'll do one more live question. What ideas do you have for interdisciplinary lessons about history and the Holocaust in particular between your departments and others at the high school, such as the World Language Department?
And I see the asker of that question is one of our world language teachers.
Oh, there you go. You can collaborate.
I think that there could be some wonderful possibilities, especially as some of the advanced language courses do look at history. And I would love to have that further conversation.
All right, well, maybe you started something there. All right, well, I think we're gonna move on. Johanna, sorry. Your important words and images were so engaging, and we thank you so much for sharing them. We as a community are certainly grateful for your innovative work in the classroom. Now, Rosalie Garut from Congregation Karem Shalom, the cantor there, will offer an original song in English, which she wrote as the daughter of Shoah survivors. It is entitled, "We Are Here."
We're here, our seeds are planted in the land. We're here, although they thought we'd die at their command. We're here, and no one will erase our stand. We're here to love again, to live, give again, to give. We're here. We came, dry branches falling from the tree. We came, not knowing how this strange new world would be. We came with all the memories of the ones we left behind. We turned our lives away from death. We took another breath and sang our songs once more we would be heard. We carry tears of many lost lives. We bear the names of those whose cries were not like smoke lost in the skies. Yet once more strong we join in song, and once again we will dance. The wedding music will enhance our lives. Our children will once more smile, and we will sing Nam Yisroel Chai.
Rosalie, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We appreciate you participating in our event every year. We really do, really do. So this comes to the conclusion. I again would like to thank Ronnie Olitsky for organizing tonight's program. She could not be with us this evening because of a death in the family, but she did a lot of work to organize everybody. We thank the Select Board for continuing to co-sponsor this event. I'd like to thank Charisse Aladwar on our committee for assisting with the publicity, and thank you to Jeremy and Chris for assisting with the technical aspects of tonight's program. We definitely could not have done tonight without them. We also we appreciate the support of our town manager, Stephen Crane, who is here tonight, and also our police chief, Joe O'Connor, who I think is here, but may not be, but in any case, he supports our events always. To get on our email list or to ask any more questions that you have, we could pass them on to Johanna. And to support our work, please go to our website at cchumanrights.org. And many thanks to all of you who are here with us this evening. In a Globe editorial about the anti-Semitic football calls in Duxbury, the Globe mentioned the Rodriguez bill that will set up a permanent genocide education trust to fund programs about the inhumanity of genocide in all public schools and districts in Massachusetts. We feel we're ahead of the game with educators like Johanna in our school system. May Johanna's work inspire other teachers to help our youth to know why we say never forget and always remember, and that we must keep fighting injustice. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Amen.